Hello everyone, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 and welcome to a very special edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. And today I am going to be taking a look at the amazing and impressive Sideman catalogue from legendary guitarist, composer and bandleader Pat Metheny. And this marks the first time ever on this series that I will be discussing an artist's catalogue of albums where they're not the leader, but they are featured as a sideman. And who better to discuss their work as a sideman than iconic guitarist Pat Metheny? And aside from leading his own bands such as the Pat Metheny Group, the Pat Metheny Unity Band / Unity Group, Side Eye, various trios, quartets, quintets, large ensembles, duo collaborations, and playing solo, I have always felt that some of Pat Metheny's best playing has been with other artists where he's featured as a sideman. And throughout his legendary career, Pat Metheny has played with a very diverse collection of different artists in a number of different styles and genres of music. And I have always said that some of Pat Metheny's best work and playing has been with other people. And I've often compared him in that sort of category with another legendary guitarist, Alan Holdsworth. So, for example, if you needed a guitar solo on your album, Alan Holdsworth was your guy. And I always looked at him as the secret weapon in the band, where he would come forth, blow everyone away with the most incredible guitar solo you have ever heard, leaving everyone's jaws dropping. Pat Metheny, I would put in that same conversation because Pat Metheny, we all know he's an iconic band leader. That goes without saying. But he's also an incredible team player and he's a special musician, much like Alan Holdsworth was, where he can come in and make anything, everything, and everyone around him sound better. And he's got this special ability where just by his mere presence alone can just elevate not only the entire band, but the players and the music to the highest level. And as I said, some of Pat Metheny's best playing, in my opinion, has been with other artists. And anytime you buy an album and Pat Metheny is featured as a sideman, I can guarantee you that album is going to be instantly successful just by Pat Metheny's name alone. And some of my favorite albums where Pat Metheny is featured as a sideman are just incredible. It really is. And you get to see a different side to Pat Metheny. Now, obviously, with his own work, you expect him to play amazing because it's his album, it's his band. But there's just a different level of excitement when Pat Metheny is a member of the band as a sideman. And the bulk of his work as a sideman, he has mainly played with singers, drummers, and sax players. In fact, a large portion of his work as a sideman has mostly been with sax players. And there's just something about that. It really is, where Pat Metheny plays with these different musicians and his guitar playing just adapts to the person he's with. And for me, it really shows how versatile and diverse Pat Metheny is, not only as a guitar player, but as a musician as well. He can just adapt to any situation. And this is something that I've been wanting to do on this series for a really long time now, to talk about a musician who's been around for a really long time and just played with so many big names and legends in the music world. And as I said earlier, who better to discuss their work as a sideman than legendary guitarist Pat Metheny? And I'm hoping to do another one like this in the near future, where you have an iconic musician who has been around for a really long time, and their best work has been as a sideman with a number of different bands in a variety of different styles and genres of music. So, for today's special edition, I am going to be taking a look at Pat Metheny's Sideman catalogue of albums, which have been handpicked by me. And as always, I'm going to be talking about each album individually, and I'll be choosing which one I think is the best one. And my choice for the best one, which I will reveal at the end, may surprise some of you because this one that I've chosen as Pat Metheny's best Sideman album, some of you may have not heard of it. So I'll leave that for you at the end when we get there because I guarantee you some of you may have not heard of this one, but I thought this one was just absolutely excellent. And I've included it in this one as well. But as I said, we'll get there when we do. And when we go through Pat Metheny's Sideman catalogue, you will notice how Pat Metheny's guitar playing is constantly changing and evolving, and how he is able to adapt to the artist he is playing with. And as I said, it's a true testament to Pat Metheny's versatility as a musician. You know, he's so diverse and he can just adapt to any style of music and environment that he's playing in. And as I said earlier, he's just able to just elevate everything around him and just make the music sound even better. And 95% of that artist's success in terms of their music is down to Pat Metheny just by his mere presence alone. So we're going to start with the first Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this is a double live album which came out in 1980, and this is Joni Mitchell, Shadows and Light. So Pat Metheny is a member of Joni Mitchell's all-star band, which is comprised of Pat Metheny himself on guitar, longtime collaborator and keyboardist from PMG, Lyle Mays, legendary bassist Jaco Pastorius from Weather Report, drummer and percussionist Don Alias, and legendary saxophonist Michael Brecker. Now, that is a serious collection of monster talent. Just think about that for a second. Those names alone. Pat Metheny, Lyle Mays, Jaco Pastorius, Don Alias, and Michael Brecker on the same stage, backing Joni Mitchell, does not get any better than that. And it's a magnificent concert. Pat Metheny, like always, his guitar playing shines brightly, and he steals the show in some moments, and kind of takes Joni Mitchell's music in an almost PMG direction, which is no surprise because Pat Metheny, as a guitar player, he has such a massive presence, and like always, he just makes anything, everything, everyone around him even better. And he really takes Joni Mitchell's compositions and elevates them to the next level. And some of his best playing on here is just absolutely incredible. So it's a double album, as I mentioned. So on this one, we got In France They Kiss on Main Street, Edith and the Kingpin, Coyote, Goodbye, Pork Pie Hat, The Dry Cleaner from Des Moines, Amelia, Pat Solo, Hijra, and then on disc two, we've got Black Crow, Don Solo, Dreamland, Free Man in Paris, and a little introduction from Joni Mitchell introducing everyone. Fairy Sings the Blues, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, the title track Shadows and Lights, God Must Be a Boogeyman, and Woodstock. So this is pretty much some of Joni Mitchell's most well-known compositions and features some of the biggest names ever playing her material alongside her. And every musician sounds amazing, but for me, Pat Metheny, he just shines the brightest. And as I said, some of his best guitar playing is on this album, and he just sounds incredible. And the standout tracks for me where Pat Metheny's guitar playing is really on full display and showcased are In France They Kiss on Main Street, Pat Solo, The Dry Cleaner from Des Moines, Black Crow, Free Man in Paris, Furry Sings the Blues, and Why Do Fools Fall in Love, and the title track Shadows and Light. Excellent album, and again, Pat Metheny showing his versatility, playing in a more pop environment as opposed to the jazz and jazz fusion world that we all know him for. And like I said, Pat Metheny's just able to adapt and thrive in any environment you put him in, and he does exactly that here with the lovely and super talented Joni Mitchell, who, dare I say, she's on fine form as well, playing guitar and singing beautifully as always. So there you have it, Joni Mitchell, Shadows and Light, a legendary concert featuring some of the biggest names ever in the music world. And of course, Pat Metheny doing what he does best, and that's just making everything sound better. So there you have it. Joni Mitchell, Shadows and Light, legendary double live album. Excellent. And what makes this album even more special is most of the guys, apart from Joni Mitchell and Pat Metheny, are sadly no longer with us. But this just makes it even more special to have such an iconic document showcasing the biggest names in the world. So there you have it. Joni Mitchell, Shadows and Light. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1986. And some people may not know this one, they may have not heard of it, but it's an incredible album, and it features Pat Metheny's great guitar playing on full display. And it's from his brother, trumpeter Mike Metheny, and this one is called Day In, Night Out. So this features Pat Metheny as a sideman on his brother Mike Metheny's album. And apart from one track, Pat Metheny plays a big role in the music, and he just sounds absolutely amazing. And his guitar playing is on full display. And it's great to hear him and his brother playing together, and they match up musically very well. And it's interesting that Pat Metheny came from a trumpet family, but here he is playing guitar alongside his brother, who is an incredible trumpet player. And Pat Metheny, even though he doesn't play trumpet, we all know that he gets a trumpet sound with his guitar synthesizer synclavier. And although he doesn't play synclavier on this album, you know, you can really hear just in his guitar playing that trumpet sensibility that draws from his background of a trumpet family. And the two brothers sound incredible together, and some of the best Pat Metheny guitar playing is on this album, Day In, Night Out. And the standout tracks for me that have Pat Metheny's guitar playing on full display is Vanity, Segment, Like the Ocean, and Epilogue. And as I said, an album that's not very well known to some Pat Metheny fans, but definitely worth checking out just to hear some of that great guitar playing that we all know. And as I said, you know, Pat Metheny's got that special ability to elevate everyone and everything around him, and he does exactly that here with his own brother's album. He just makes everything sound amazing, and he's on top form as you'd expect. So there you have it. Mike Metheny, Day In, Night Out. A little bit of an obscure album, but highly recommend you check it out if you can find it. There's some tasty guitar playing, courtesy of Pat Metheny. So there you have it. It's Mike Metheny, Day In, Night Out. Excellent album and a little bit underrated, I would say. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1987, and it's absolutely legendary for a lot of reasons. Number one, because of the musician he's playing with, and all of the players that are a part of this album, who would all go on to be Pat Metheny's main collaborators all throughout the 80s all the way up to the early 2000s. And this collaboration between these two legendary musicians goes all the way back to Pat Metheny's iconic double 8081 album. And these two together, in my opinion, was just pure magic, and they made some of the best music ever. And Pat Metheny was a huge part of this guy's career and helped really elevate his music. And this album is a self titled album from the one and only Michael Brecker. So, as I said, Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker had a long collaborative association that goes all the way back to Pat Metheny's double 8081 album. And you could kind of look at it like Michael Brecker really came into his own hooking up with Pat Metheny. And 8081 set the stage for his solo career, which he would launch with this album just 7 years later. And Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker made a lot of history together and made some incredible music. And it really kicked off into overdrive with this one. And the level of star power on this album is just absolutely incredible. So we've got Pat Metheny on guitar, Charlie Haden on bass, Jack DeJohnette on drums, and Kenny Kirkland on piano and keyboards. And Don Gronick, although he doesn't play on this album, he produced this one. Absolutely incredible. The star power alone is just wow, amazing. Now, Pat Metheny's presence on this album, although it is quite large, he does kind of take a bit of a backseat in the music, as opposed to his later sideman appearances where he's quite dominant. Pat Metheny's guitar playing is a lot more restrained and a lot more laid back. That's not to say that his guitar playing isn't soulful. It is. You know, his guitar playing here is on full display, but it's not as harsh and ferocious as opposed to his later appearances. But just his presence alone really helps elevate Michael Brecker's music. And the two of them together, as I said, it's just magic. They really work so well together. And I love their collaboration. You know, some of the best music I've ever listened to came from just these two working together. And anytime Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker got together, it was always an event. It was always special. And I just loved hearing them play together. And, you know, I have a lot of fond memories listening to these two bouncing off one another. They just were such a great team. They really were. And as I said, Pat Metheny's got that special ability to just elevate anything, everything, and everyone around him. And all of these guys, especially Pat Metheny, Michael Brecker, Charlie Haden, and Jack DeJohnette, they would continue to play and collaborate with each other all throughout the 80s, all the way up to the early 2000s. And wow, what more can you say, really? Some serious star power here. And the tracks that stand out to me where Pat Metheny's guitar playing is on full display is Syzygy, where he delivers a very haunting guitar solo. Nothing Personal is another great showcase of Pat Metheny's guitar playing. Original Rays is great guitar playing from Pat Metheny, and the bonus track, My One and Only Love, is just absolutely gorgeous with another great Pat Metheny guitar solo. But Pat Metheny sounds absolutely amazing on Michael Brecker's self-titled album. As I said, he's more restrained and a lot more laid back, so he's not as wild and fiery as you would hear on later albums where he's the sideman, but he still sounds fantastic and he just elevates the music, as do everyone else here, but Pat Metheny really shines brightly on this one. So there you have it. Michael Brecker's self-titled album, an absolute classic and legendary, mainly because of Pat Metheny. Tremendous stuff. Love it. And what makes the Michael Brecker self-titled album even more special is, apart from Pat Metheny and Jack DeJohnette, most of the musicians that were featured on that album are sadly no longer with us. Don Gronick passed away in 1986. Kenny Kirkland passed away in 1988. Michael Brecker sadly passed away in 2007, and Charlie Hayden passed away in 2014. So not only do you have the self-titled album as a living historic document, but it also showcases all of those legends in their prime at the top of their game. So we're going to move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1990, and it's with a musician who pretty much started Pat Metheny's solo career when he joined his band as a young kid, and this marked the first time since 1977's Passengers album that these two had played together, and it's a true moment and event seeing the teacher and the students coming together once again. And it really shows you not only how much Pat Metheny has evolved since the last time that these two had played together, but it really shows you that it's just pure magic that anytime these two got together, it was always very special. And you can say that a lot of Pat Metheny's success is owed to this guy who Pat Metheny played with in his band for 3 years. And the album I am talking about is, of course, Gary Burton Reunion. So Pat Metheny was a teenager when he first joined Gary Burton's band. And Pat Metheny has always said that joining Gary Burton's band was like joining the Beatles. It was such an important moment for him, not just in his career, but in his life. And I could probably agree with Pat Metheny's statement about that. Playing with a legend like Gary Burton is a huge deal, especially when you look at some of the iconic guitarists who have played in Gary Burton's bands, names like Larry Coryell and Mick Goodrick, to name a few. Some pretty big names there, and Pat Metheny joins an elite club of iconic guitar players. So, as I said, this is a reunion album. This marked the first time since 1977's Passengers that Gary Burton and Pat Metheny had played together. And it really shows you that Pat Metheny and Gary Burton together is just pure magic. They hadn't lost a single step or beat. They play together like they just played yesterday. But you really see how much Pat Metheny has evolved since last playing with Burton. Now, whereas Pat Metheny was a member of the Gary Burton band for those 3 years as a young kid, here Pat Metheny is a lot more seasoned, a little bit more older, and even though he's a sideman on this album, he's got such a large presence. And I've always looked at Reunion as it's a Pat Metheny album, but with Gary Burton on vibes. And that's not taking anything away from Gary Burton, but it's Gary Burton's album, but Pat Metheny's got such a large presence and he just elevates everything and everyone around him. And for me, Pat Metheny really brings out the best in Gary Burton's playing, and Gary Burton in turn brings out the best in Pat Metheny. And we've got an amazing band here as well. We've got keyboardist Mitch Foreman, legendary drummer Peter Erskine, and bassist Will Lee. What an amazing band. And from the first notes on this album, it's just magic. It's a gorgeous album. There's some wild moments from Pat Metheny, brings out the old guitar synth synclavier, but he's just on top form and really takes charge. But it's still Gary Burton's album, but Pat Metheny really shines with his arrangements and orchestration. It's just an amazing album. And the tracks where Pat Metheny's guitar playing is on full display is Origin, Will You Say You Will, Panama, Chairs and Children, The Chief, Quick and Running, and Autumn. It's a really good album, and for me, it's probably my favourite album from Gary Burton and Pat Metheny. And Gary Burton and Pat Metheny would continue to collaborate and play with one another throughout the 90s all the way up to the 2000s. And as I said, anytime that Gary Burton and Pat Metheny, just like Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker, it was always magic. And I loved hearing these two play together. There's such a classy sound that these two create together. It harkens back to those old days of the 70s when Pat Metheny was a young kid playing in Gary Burton's band, but it's just a lot more matured and sophisticated. And it's just absolutely amazing. So there you have it. Gary Burton Reunion, excellent album, and once again, an amazing showcase of Pat Metheny's incredible guitar playing. Love it. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1990, and it's with another musician who Pat Metheny collaborated with, which goes all the way back to Pat Metheny's double 8081 album. And these two would play together in a number of different situations. This musician played on Pat Metheny's Song X album with Ornette Coleman. They would also play together on quite a lot of Michael Brecker's albums, and they would also play together in a number of different situations live. And he's one of the greatest drummers of all time. And this is, of course, a gentleman who needs no introduction whatsoever. This is from Jack DeJohnette, and this album is, of course, Parallel Realities. So, Parallel Realities is a Jack DeJohnette album that features Pat Metheny on electric and acoustic guitars, guitar synth, and synclavier, and another legendary pianist slash keyboardist Herbie Hancock. And this is one of my all-time favourite Pat Metheny Sideman albums. Pat Metheny is on top form with a massive presence, and his guitar playing really elevates this entire album as well as all of the musicians featured. Jack DeJohnette, of course, is on top form on the drums, and Herbie Hancock has never sounded better and has never played more elegantly than he does on this album. He just sounds absolutely incredible with gorgeous piano solos. It's an amazing album, and the music is just fantastic. And this is one that I listen to all the time, and it just blows my mind, how three guys can just create a monster sound together. And they took this out on the road and they added bassist Dave Holland to the mix, and it just made it even better. A real band of true legends. Doesn't get any better than this. Pat Metheny, Jack DeJohnette, and Herbie Hancock. What a power trio. Wow. Unbelievable stuff. And most of the compositions are either written by Pat Metheny or co-composed with Jack DeJohnette. And it's quite interesting because although Jack DeJohnette is got top billing, it's his album. To me, it's a Pat Metheny album. He just really takes charge. And although he's a sideman, I look at this album as it's a supergroup. You've got three legends: Pat Metheny, Jack DeJohnette, and Herbie Hancock. You know, three massive names. But it's just magic. And wow, the production on here is excellent. And I love it. I absolutely adore this album. It's just got some of Pat Metheny's best playing, and yeah, he doesn't hold anything back here. Whether he's playing acoustic guitar or playing guitar synth or electric guitar, he's just all over this album. And wow, it's just so big and epic. And the standout tracks for me of Pat Metheny's guitar playing is Jackin', Nine Over Reggae, John McKee, Indigo Dreamscapes, and for me, the real highlight of this entire album is the title track, Parallel Realities, which is like an 11-minute epic. And the middle section where Pat Metheny plays guitar synth, he just absolutely rips it up. And it just sounds like a guy playing like it's his last. He just really goes to town. And it's just an amazing album and amazing moments. And I just absolutely love this album. Parallel Realities just kicks ass, and one of my all-time favorite Pat Metheny Sideman albums. He just really lets it rip. So there you have it. Jack DeJohnette, Parallel Realities, one of my all-time favorites Pat Metheny Sideman albums. Fantastic, and the live band with Dave Holland is even better. Highly recommend you check this one out, and the DVD of that tour with Dave Holland. Unbelievable stuff. There you have it. Jack DeJohnette, Parallel Realities, excellent stuff. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1992, and it's with another great saxophonist who Pat Metheny collaborated with, and I thought these two worked really well together. And this sees a different side of Pat Metheny's guitar playing. You get to hear Pat Metheny almost in shredder mode, so to speak. He really rocks it up on this one, and it features an amazing band of some unbelievable players. And this is one that I really like listening to a lot. And this was quite a big album from what I remember, and it's been reissued a couple of times, and it's one of my all-time favourites Pat Metheny Sideman albums. And this is from saxophonist Gary Thomas, and this one is called Till We Have Faces. So this features Pat Metheny pretty much in full-on electric mode. He really shreds it up on guitar, and I thought him and Gary Thomas really worked well together. Gary Thomas is a bit of a different sax player to Michael Brecker. Gary Thomas, I always looked at him as a fusion sax player, and he done some amazing work with legendary guitarist John McLaughlin. He was a part of his band for one or two albums, and I thought him and Pat Metheny, just worked really well together. I thought Gary Thomas and Pat Metheny really brought out the best in each other, and some of the music and style kind of harkens back to Pat Metheny's wild collaboration with Ornette Coleman. It's kind of like Song X rocked up, and he just really burns on this album. And the musicians that are featured on here is some incredible players. We've got Tim Murphy on piano, Anthony Cox on bass, we've got Ed Howard also on bass, the amazing Terry Lynn Carrington on drums, and Steve Moss on percussion. Now, as far as I'm aware of, apart from this album, I don't think Pat Metheny and Terry Lynn Carrington have done much together, which is just unbelievable. You think about some of the big names that Pat Metheny's played with in terms of the drum world, Jack DeJohnette, Danny Gottlieb, Paul Wertico, Roy Haynes, Bill Stewart, Antonio Sanchez, just to name a few. But it's quite surprising that, Pat Metheny hasn't done much with Terry Lynn Carrington. I'm quite amazed about that. Unless they have played together live and I just don't know about it. But as far as I'm aware of, this is the only recorded document that features Pat Metheny and Terry Lynn Carrington playing together. It's crazy. Now, most of the material that's featured on this album is standards. So we've got like covers of tracks from Horace Silver, Sammy Cahn, Billy Strayhorn, Leo Robin, and Irving Berlin, to name a few. So there's no original material. It's just an all-star band playing standards and putting their own spin on things. And this band really cooks. And Pat Metheny, at times when he burns it up, he sounds like John Scofield. The way he gets that distortion and reverb in his guitar playing really sounds like John Scofield. And of course, as we know, Pat Metheny and John Scofield, they made an excellent duo album together. I Can See Your House From Here, which is excellent. And just like always, Pat Metheny just elevates everything and everyone around him. And I love it. I think it's an absolute amazing album. Pat Metheny has a large presence on the guitar, and he just really burns it up. So the standout tracks for me where Pat Metheny's guitar playing is on full display, is Angel Eyes, The Best Thing for You, and my favourite track on this entire album, Lush Life, which features Pat Metheny on acoustic guitar and Gary Thomas on sax. It's just a duo track, absolutely beautiful. I love it. Peace is a great track, and You Don't Know What Love Is. Pat Metheny just rips it up on guitar synth, and wow, it's just some of Pat Metheny's most aggressive and wild guitar playing on this album. Till We Have Faces, I just think he just really burns it up, and at times he is almost in super shredder mode. He really shreds it up, and Pat Metheny is not really known much as a burner like an Al Di Meola or a McLaughlin or a Holdsworth, but he can do it too when he wants to. He's no slouch in that area. It's not really what he's known for, but when he does, he can do it as good as anyone who's ever picked up the guitar, and he just sounds fantastic on this album, as does Gary Thomas and Terry Lynn Carrington, everybody else. So there you have it. Gary Thomas, Till We Have Faces, another favourite Pat Metheny sideman album of mine. Absolutely love it. And what a treat to hear Pat Metheny in burning shredder mode. Love it. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny sideman album, and this one came out in 1993. And this is with a musician who Pat Metheny shared a lot of history with his dad, who played on Pat Metheny's double 8081 album. And it also features kind of a mini reunion between Pat Metheny and the rhythm section. And Pat Metheny played a huge role in helping to elevate this young musician's career and pretty much helped him become the man that he is today. And the young sax player, of course, is Joshua Redman, and this album is Wish. So, Wish features, as I mentioned, a little reunion featuring Pat Metheny, Charlie Hayden, and Billy Higgins, who collaborated together on Pat Metheny's legendary trio album, Rejoicing. So, it's great to hear those three play together once again, and with Joshua Redman added to the mix. And Joshua Redman is, of course, the son of saxophonist Dewey Redman, who, as I mentioned, played with Pat Metheny on his double 8081 album. And Joshua Redman is a different sax player to his dad. Dewey Redman was more of an avant-garde sax player. Joshua Redman, he's much more of a traditional jazz saxophonist, but he can still dabble in that area when he wants to. And Pat Metheny, like always, elevates everyone and everything around him, and he just sounds absolutely incredible, as always. And he takes more of a laid back approach on this album, so he doesn't really burn it up like he did with Gary Thomas on his Till We Have Faces album. So he's a lot more laid back, there's a lot more acoustic playing, and Pat Metheny just sounds incredible, as does Joshua Redman, Charlie Hayden, and Billy Higgins. And the material that's featured on here is we've got two Pat Metheny originals, we got one Charlie Hayden original, we got three Joshua Redman compositions, and we got two covers of Stevie Wonder and Eric Clapton. And we've also got two standards, one by Ornette Coleman and one by the legendary Charlie Parker. So quite a little diverse collection of material. And Pat Metheny, he's just on top form as always. And I thought him and Joshua Redman worked very well together. As I said, Joshua Redman is a different sax player to Gary Thomas and Michael Brecker, but he's absolutely fantastic. And this is a very laid back album, but a lovely album nonetheless. And the acoustic playing for me by Pat Metheny on Wish, it's just absolutely beautiful, and I love it. I was just listening to Wish earlier, and I just forgot how good Pat Metheny sounded on this album, and that's the beauty of Pat Metheny. He may be a sideman in name, but I've always looked at him as like he's a special guest, and the way he just adds these little things to the music to make things even better. It's just amazing. You know, he's such a good musician, Pat Metheny. He really is, and he can just take anything and make it not only his own, but just make it sound amazing. And the standout tracks for me, where Pat Metheny's guitar playing is on full display, is "We Had a Sister," "Soul Dance," "The Deserving Many," "Wish," and "Tears in Heaven." I just love that opening acoustic guitar intro by Pat Metheny. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And then Redman's sax playing comes into the mix. It just even better. It's just absolutely amazing. So there you have it. Joshua Redman, Wish. Another fantastic Pat Metheny sideman album, and one that I've recently gone back to listening to again after a number of years, and sounds as good as I can remember, if not better. Absolutely a lovely album, highly recommended. And for me, this is where Joshua Redman really came into his own. And even though he already had one album out prior to this, I think really this helped put Joshua Redman on the map. And a lot of that is thanks to Pat Metheny. You know, he can take someone under his wing, mold them, and then just elevate them to the next level. And he does exactly that with this album. So there you have it. Joshua Redman, Wish. A lovely album and a very enjoyable one. Love it. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1994, and this features another musician who also happens to be one of the greatest drummers of all time. And Pat Metheny and this guy made an excellent trio album called Question and Answer with bassist Dave Holland. And anytime these two got together, it was always magic. And the drummer, of course, is one and only Roy Haynes. And this is Tivu. So, Tivu is a Roy Haynes solo album. And Roy Haynes has put together an all-star cast of musicians. So we've got Pat Metheny on guitar, David Kokoski on piano, Donald Harrison on alto sax, and Christian McBride on bass. And a lot of the material that's featured on here is a lot of Pat Metheny originals, and we've got a couple of standards as well, and we've got one original from Donald Harrison. But it's a fun album, very enjoyable, very upbeat, lots of energy, and Pat Metheny, as always, as a sideman, he just elevates anything and everything around him. And there's some great fun versions of some of Pat Metheny's well-known material. And as I said, there's some standards and some Metheny originals, and I love it. So we got Like This by Chick Corea, John McKee by Pat Metheny, James by Pat Metheny and Lyle Mays, If I Could by Pat Metheny, Blues M45 by Charlie Hayden, Trinkle Winkle by Thelonious Monk, Trigonometry by Ornette Coleman and Pat Metheny, and Good for the Soul by Donald Harrison. Great collection of material. No Roy Haynes originals, unfortunately, but Roy Haynes, he just sounds like a monster on the drums. Pat Metheny is on top form as always on guitars and just elevates anything, everyone around him, and just makes everyone sound fantastic. And the standout tracks for me of Pat Metheny's great guitar playing is John McKee, James, If I Could, Trigonometry, and Good for the Soul. Very fun, upbeat album, and some great guitar playing from Pat Metheny. And what makes this album even more historic is we lost Roy Haynes not too long ago, but anytime Pat Metheny and Roy Haynes got together, it was always a lot of fun, and they really brought out the best in each other. And some of Roy Haynes' best drumming was with Pat Metheny, and Pat Metheny, he just sounds great with everyone. And here is no exception on Tivu. It's just an amazing album, and Pat Metheny really shines on this one. As I said, you know, he's a sideman, but you'd never really get that sense that Pat Metheny's just going to sit back and, you know, just play in the background. He's going to get his playing in as well. And as I said, he just knows how to elevate everyone, but he doesn't like, you know, dominate the proceedings. It's still Roy Haynes' album, but Pat Metheny really gets to shine, and everyone works out better for it. It's just unbelievable. So there you have it. Roy Haynes, Tivu, excellent stuff. Love it. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this came out in 1986. And we see Pat Metheny reuniting once again with the one and only saxophonist Michael Brecker to produce one of the best albums from their collaboration. And it's one of my favourite Pat Metheny Sideman albums. And this one is Tales from the Hudson. I love this album. As I said, all of Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker's albums they made together during their long legendary collaboration is excellent, but this one is one of my favourite albums and one of their best ones. And what an all-star cast of musicians we got here. So we've got Pat Metheny on guitars, Jack DeJohnette on drums, Dave Holland on bass, Joey Calderazzo on piano, and we've also got guest appearances from McCoy Tyner and Don Alias. Tales from the Hudson, remarkable album. Everyone's on top form, and Pat Metheny, he's got a much larger presence on this one as opposed to the self-titled album by Michael Brecker, but he just sounds amazing and he really burns it up and just makes everything sound even better. And Metheny and Brecker, always a great show, always magic when they got together, and here is no exception. They just sound fantastic together. And the standout tracks for me that feature some of Pat Metheny's great guitar playing is Slings and Arrows, Song for Bilboa, which is a Pat Metheny Group composition where Pat Metheny plays guitar sim and him and Brecker just absolutely cook up a monster storm together. And I love it when their unison lines come together. Chills. Absolutely love it. African Skies, another great track as well, featuring Metheny's great guitar playing. And Naked Soul, which has got almost like a very laid back Jim Hall quality to it. Absolutely gorgeous. And Cabin Fever, another great track as well, with some great guitar playing from Pat Metheny. And Midnight Voyage as well. It's got kind of like a nice bluesy little bit of guitar playing from Metheny. Just absolutely brilliant. Some of Pat Metheny's best guitar playing is on Tales from the Hudson. So there you have it. Michael Brecker, Tales from the Hudson, one of my all-time favourites Pat Metheny Sideman albums. Excellent stuff. Wonderful album. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1996. And this is a very special album, mainly because of the musician that Pat Metheny played with, who also happens to be one of the greatest drummers that ever lived. And he was a huge part of the fusion movement back in the 70s. And he also played with legendary guitarists like Alan Holdsworth and John McLaughlin. And just to have Pat Metheny and this guy together was very special, as he would pass away not too long after this album came out. But I'm really glad we got these two together to make this album. And the drummer I'm talking about is, of course, the one and only Tony Williams. And this is Wilderness. So, Wilderness is Tony Williams' solo album, which would mark as his final album, as he would pass away not too long after. And he features an all-star cast of musicians featuring Pat Metheny, Michael Brecker, Stanley Clarke, and Herbie Hancock. That is putting Super in supergroup. That is a serious band of super heavyweights, I'm telling you. And from my understanding, this is the only recorded document of Pat Metheny and Stanley Clarke. And just like I said earlier about Gary Thomas with Pat Metheny and Terry Lynn Carrington, that being the only album, Till We Have Faces, that they played together, it's just mind blowing some of the biggest names, like Pat Metheny, Terry Lynn Carrington, and Stanley Clarke. Metheny has hardly ever played with these guys other than these kind of albums, unless they play together live. But it's just crazy that Pat Metheny has never really recorded anything with Stanley Clarke. And you think about all the top bass players Pat Metheny has played with throughout his career: Charlie Hayden, Dave Holland, Larry Grenadier, you know, just to name a few. But he's never made anything with Stanley Clarke. It's just crazy. And as you'd expect, the music is absolutely amazing. Pat Metheny really shreds it up here. And just the fact that we got Pat Metheny and Tony Williams together was very special. And it's one of those things that you just think about. Like, imagine if Pat Metheny played with Tony Williams. Wonder what that would have been like. Well, we got it. It happened, and the results were excellent, as you'd expect. And the tracks where Pat Metheny really shines the most with his guitar playing is Chinatown, which is just, oh man, unbelievable stuff. China Road, The Night You Were Born, and Wilderness Island, and Sea of Wilderness. But wow, Pat Metheny really shines brightly with his guitar playing, as do all of the musicians. It's a real super group, but Pat Metheny's guitar playing just elevates everything. And just to have Metheny, Brecker, Williams, all these guys together, it's just what a dream team. It really is. So there you have it, Tony Williams, Wilderness. Fantastic album, and wow, so glad that Tony Williams got to play with Pat Metheny at least once, and we've got it here. And the music is just excellent. So there you have it, Tony Williams, Wilderness. Excellent album, and one of my favourites, Pat Metheny Sideman albums. Tremendous stuff. Love it. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1986, and it's with another sax player. I'm telling you, Pat Metheny has played with a lot of sax players, and 1996 was quite a busy year for Pat. Playing with all of these different people, as well as his own stuff as well. Tell you what, Pat Metheny was doing a lot of good stuff in 1996. And this album is with a musician who I consider to be one of the greatest alto sax players on the planet. And he played with quite possibly the biggest name in the history of jazz music, the one and only, the legendary trumpeter Miles Davis. And this album that Pat Metheny collaborated with this musician is in tribute to another iconic musician who also played with Miles Davis. And this sax player that Pat Metheny collaborated with is, of course, the one and only altoist Kenny Garrett. And this one is called Pursuance, the music of John Coltrane. So this is an album tribute to John Coltrane, and it features all of John Coltrane's most well-known compositions, with the exception of one track. And it features an amazing band. So we've got Kenny Garrett on alto sax, Pat Metheny on guitar, Rodney Whitaker on bass, and Brian Blade on drums. An all-star quartet, and wow, Pat Metheny playing John Coltrane material. Doesn't get any better than that, and who better to play it with than another great sax player, Kenny Garrett. I love this album. Pat Metheny and Kenny Garrett, what a team they made. Unbelievable. Kenny Garrett's such a monster sax player. And you add Pat Metheny to the mix. Dynamite stuff. And of course, Pat Metheny is no stranger to alto sax player. He played with, of course, the one and only Ornette Coleman. So the music here, especially with an alto sax player, kind of brings it to the Song X kind of realm, but it's still great. It's absolutely brilliant. And Pat Metheny really shines brightly with some incredible hot playing with Kenny Garrett. And what a treat to hear Pat Metheny playing John Coltrane. Doesn't get any better than this. And the standout tracks for me, where Pat Metheny's guitar playing is on full display, is Lonnie's Lemons, which has got a killer guitar synth solo at the end. Unbelievable stuff. After the Rain is beautiful. The title track, Pursuance, Alabama, Giant Steps, and my favourite track of the whole album, Latifah. It's just got Kenny Garrett and Pat Metheny just absolutely going for it. And it kind of reminds me of Song X a little bit, with the way the guitar synth and the alto sax just blend together in unison. And these two monster musicians work really well together. And again, just like always, as a sideman, Pat Metheny just makes everything sound better. Not that Kenny Garrett needs elevating, but having Pat Metheny there with him doesn't hurt. And these two really brought out the best in one another and really took each other's playing to new heights. And I would have loved to have seen more from these two. I know Pat Metheny did guest on another Kenny Garrett album, but it was only like one or two tracks. But this is the only album where they really play together in full, and what a treat. I love Kenny Garrett. He's an amazing sax player, and Pat Metheny, just like always, he just really made Kenny Garrett even better, if that was possible. So there you have it. Kenny Garrett, Pursuance, the music of John Coltrane, one of my all-time favourite Pat Metheny sideman albums. Absolutely love it. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny sideman album, and this one came out in 1997, and it's with another sax player who I consider to be one of the greatest sax players of all time. And this album, although it's very respected, some people don't know about this one much. It doesn't really get talked about a lot, but I absolutely love this album. It's one of my all-time favorite Pat Metheny sideman albums, and you know, this album is kind of like reminds me of what the Pat Metheny Unity Band would sound like years later. Although the Unity Band didn't come till 2012, but when I listen to the Unity Band album, it kind of harkens back to this album in particular. And Pat Metheny and this musician work really well together. It's mostly a very laid back album. It's very atmospheric. There are some wild moments on this album, but for the most part, it's a really lovely album. And from what I've read, is this musician auditioned a number of different guitar players to play this album with him, and none of them could do it. But Pat Metheny walked straight in and nailed it after one try, and that's what led to this album. And I absolutely adore this album. I listen to this one quite a lot, and the musician that Pat Metheny collaborated with is, of course, iconic saxophonist David Lieben, and this one is called The Elements, Water. David Lieben, one of the greatest sax players of all time, mostly known as a soprano sax player, but he also plays tenor saxophone and wood flute on this one. And we've got Pat Metheny, of course, on guitar, and we've got an amazing rhythm section comprised of legends, drummer Billy Hart and bassist Cecil McBee. And all of the compositions are David Lieben originals, and it's about the concept of the elements, water. And Pat Metheny, his guitar playing, absolutely beautiful, at times very atmospheric, and at times quite hair raising, but very enjoyable. And some of Pat Metheny's best guitar playing is on this album. And it's different because with guys like Ornette Coleman or Kenny Garrett or even Michael Brecker, it's a bit more muscular, it's a bit more out there. This one is a lot more laid back. Although Pat Metheny does have some moments where he gets to shred it up, but it's a very good album. And as I said, from top to bottom, it's kind of like some little interludes here and there which is kind of like what you'd expect from a concept album, but it's very good. And I think Pat Metheny and David Lieben really bring out the best in one another. And once again, Pat Metheny just elevates everything he does and just makes everything he plays in sound better. And what he does with David Lieben's compositions, he just adds his own voice to it, and he just sounds incredible. And it brings up lots of different guitars. Now, on some of his previous sideman appearances, he mainly just plays like standard jazz guitar and some acoustic guitar, and he might occasionally bring out the guitar synth. Here, he's playing a lot of like steel string guitars, 42 string Picasso, and traditional acoustic guitar playing, and of course the guitar synth. So he's got quite a variety of different guitars that's he's featured on this album. And the standout tracks for me featuring Pat Metheny's great guitar playing is Water, Giver of Life, Reflecting Pool, Storm Surge, Guitar Interlude, Baptismal Font, and Ebb and Flow, which is just wild with the guitar synth and the soprano sax, which kind of reminds me of the Unity band Roof Dogs years later. It's just absolutely mad, and I love it. Absolutely love it. And what an amazing band we got here. David Lieben, Pat Metheny, Billy Hart, and Cecil McBee. Some serious legends there, in my opinion. And it's a fantastic album. It's absolutely gorgeous, and it really explores different concepts of water. Absolutely beautiful album, and again, some of Pat Metheny's best guitar playing. So there you have it, David Lieben, The Elements, Water. A beautiful album, criminally underrated, and highly recommended that you check this one out. Absolutely brilliant, and one of Pat Metheny's finest hours as a sideman. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny sideman album, and this one came out in 1988, and this time it's with a bass player. So this is quite a rare sideman appearance for Pat Metheny, playing on a bass player's album, because as I mentioned earlier, the bulk of Pat Metheny's work as a sideman has been predominantly with drummers and sax players. So to actually hear Pat Metheny with a bass player this time is quite a difference. So, especially as Pat Metheny has played with some of the greatest bass players of all time. Now, this bass player in particular, he's more known for playing with Pat Metheny's longtime collaborator from the Pat Metheny Group, keyboardist Lyle Mays. So I was always curious about whether or not Pat Metheny and this bass player would ever get together one day. But they finally did, and the results are very pleasing. And this also features another icon as well, one of the greatest guitar players of all time. And this album is from bassist Mark Johnson, and this one is called The Sound of Summer Running. Now, you can look at The Sound of Summer Running as Bass Desires Mark II, and I'll tell you why that is, because featured on this album is Mark Johnson on bass, Bill Frisell on guitars, Pat Metheny on guitars, and Jerry Barron on drums. Now, Mark Johnson Bass Desires featured John Scofield, Bill Frisell, and Peter Erskine. And from what I read and heard, Pat Metheny was intended to be part of Mark Johnson Bass Desires for one album, but unfortunately, Pat Metheny couldn't make it. And that's why John Scofield came into the mix. So we finally got round to it, fast forward to 1988, and Pat Metheny and Bill Frisell together, two of the biggest guitar names in the world, on the same album, in the same band. Doesn't get any better than that. And Jerry Barron, who takes the place of Peter Erskine, an amazing drummer in his own right. And I guess you could look at this album as Bass Desires Mark II, because you've got Bill Frisell, you've got Mark Johnson, two guys who are known as long-time collaborators for Lyle Mays. So it makes sense to have Pat Metheny in that mix. And Pat Metheny and Bill Frisell, that's a dream team. That really is. And you've got Mark Johnson and Joe Barron. Just what an amazing band. And some great guitar playing. And it's amazing when you look at how different Metheny and Frisell sound in their guitar playing. Bill Frisell's guitar playing, you can hear a lot of country influences, like hillbilly, sort of style. Pat Metheny's guitar playing is very Midwestern grassroots, obviously being from Kansas City. So when you put the two together, it's magic. It really is. And these two work really well together. I'm quite surprised, Pat Metheny made a guitar duo album with Jim Hall and John Scofield, but never Bill Frisell. Quite surprising. And it's a gorgeous album. It's a very summery album. It's a very upbeat, feel good album. So there's not much wild stuff going on here, but it's a lovely album and very enjoyable. And I was listening to this recently, and yeah, it's a beautiful album. I really enjoyed this one a lot. And the standout tracks for me, featuring Pat Metheny's unbelievable guitar playing, Ghost Town, Summer Running, In a Quiet Place, and For a Thousand Years. Brilliant stuff. Pat Metheny elevating everything and everyone around him. And yeah, I guess you could look at this album as Bass Desires Mark II. As I said, you've got Johnson and Frisell, so kind of brings it home more closer to the iconic Bass Desires band. So yeah, you could look at this as Bass Desires Mark II and the third Bass Desires album, even though it's not billed as Bass Desires. It kind of is in a way, but Pat Metheny, as always, he just elevates everything. So there you have it. Mark Johnson, The Sound of Summer Running. Beautiful album. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1988. And this sees Pat Metheny and Gary Burton reunite and playing together once more. And this features some of the biggest and most important names in the history of jazz music. And it also marks another first for Pat Metheny. And this one is called Like Minds. So, Like Minds features Gary Burton, Pat Metheny, Dave Holland, Roy Haynes, and Chick Corea. And Like Minds marks the first and only time that Pat Metheny and Chick Corea have ever played on an album together. Now, of course, Pat Metheny and Chick Corea have played together before. They played together back in 1981 at the Woodstock Jazz Festival with Anthony Braxton, Lee Konitz, Jack DeJohnette, and Miroslav Vitches, but they never ever recorded any music together until Like Minds. And for me, this was a huge deal. Two of my all-time favorite musicians, Pat Metheny and Chick Corea, in my Mount Rushmore of jazz on an album together, doesn't get any better than that. And most of the material on Like Minds is written and composed by Pat Metheny and Chick Corea, with the exception of one standard and one Gary Burton original. Come on, Pat Metheny and Chick Corea composing your music, that's dream stuff right there in itself. And what a treat to hear Pat Metheny and Chick Corea playing together. Just gives me chills. And of course, Dave Holland and Roy Haynes, no strangers to Pat Metheny and Chick Corea. Roy Haynes, of course, has played with Chick Corea on their historic Now He Sings, Now He Sobs piano trio. Dave Holland, of course, has played with Chick Corea in their band Circle. And of course, Dave Holland has played with Pat Metheny on his legendary Question and Answer Trio album alongside Roy Haynes. So there's a lot of musical history on this album. And of course, as we know, Gary Burton and Chick Corea have made some of the greatest duo albums ever in a legendary duo collaboration in their own right. So a lot of musical history and true jazz music royalty featured on Like Minds. And some unbelievable playing from Pat Metheny. He just shines like he always does. And hearing him trading unison lines and solos with Chick Corea is just doesn't get any better than that. I just get chills just talking about it and hearing it in my head. It's just unbelievable stuff. A true dream team. That's all I've got to say. Absolutely love this album. Absolutely beautiful album and a very laid back album as well. So you're seeing Pat Metheny in a much more laid back fashion. So we don't get to really hear Pat Metheny bring out the old guitar synclavier like he usually does. Pat Metheny plays a lot more restrained and very melodic, but still very pleasing to the ears. So the tracks where Pat Metheny's guitar playing shines brightest is Question and Answer, Like Minds, Tears of Rain, For 1,000 Years, and Straight Up and Down. Doesn't get any better than that. Pat Metheny playing with some of the biggest legends ever. And I don't look at this as the Gary Burton band or Pat Metheny as a sideman. It's a super group. And Pat Metheny plays a big part on Like Minds. He composed half of the material and Chick Corea composed the other half. And when you've got this level of star power, special things are going to happen. And when you've got Pat Metheny and Chick Corea as your main composers for this album, you know you're going to get the absolute best. And yeah, this is some of Pat Metheny's best playing, and what a treat for me to hear Metheny and Corea together. Only happened once, and we got it here, so I'm really happy about that. And again, what makes this album, just like some of these other albums I've talked about, two of the five musicians on this album are no longer with us. Chick Corea passed away in 2021, and Roy Haynes passed away in 2024. So sad, but at least we got this nice album to look back on, and we got to hear Pat Metheny and Chick Corea playing. So I'm happy with that. So there you have it. Gary Burton, Like Minds. Excellent album, and a nice rare treat to hear Pat Metheny and Chick Corea playing together. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 1999. And this is Pat Metheny joining forces once again with longtime collaborator saxophonist Michael Brecker. And this is a little bit of a different kind of album from Michael Brecker, but still very enjoyable nonetheless. And this one is called Time is the Essence. So this sees Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker working together once again, this time alongside organist Larry Goldings and three of the finest drummers in the world, Elvin Jones, Jeff Tain Watts, and Bill Stewart. And this is the first and only Michael Brecker album that features Pat Metheny not to have a bass player. Look at some of the previous albums that Metheny made with Michael Brecker. They had either Charlie Hayden or Dave Holland. So this is another first as well. Pat Metheny playing on an album that doesn't feature a bass player. And it features another first for Pat Metheny. This is the only time Pat Metheny and Larry Goldings have ever played together on an album. Pat Metheny, of course, is no stranger to Bill Stewart. They played together as part of Pat Metheny's trio 99-2000 with bassist Larry Grenadier. And this also marks another first for Pat Metheny. This is the only time he's also played with Elvin Jones and Jeff Tain Watts. So lots of firsts, lots of one-offs. Pat Metheny, as always, shines bright on this album, as he does on all of his sideman appearances. And of course, Pat Metheny works magic with Michael Brecker. And the standout tracks for me, where Pat Metheny's guitar playing stands out, is Arc of the Pendulum, Half Past Late, Timeline, As I Am, and Outrant. Pat Metheny working very well and adapting to another environment, this time without a bass player, especially as bass players have been a huge part of Pat Metheny's music and his identity. So hearing him playing alongside an organ player was a nice treat. And obviously, Pat Metheny would add the organ to his own music many years later with his Side Eye project. So nice treat. It's kind of nice to see where he got the idea from, which came from this album. But very enjoyable. Love this album a lot. And the band that went out on tour was Brecker, Metheny, Goldings, and Stewart. All due respect to Elvin Jones and Jeff Tane Watts, great drummers, but I'm a Bill Stewart guy, and I love Bill Stewart. He's an amazing drummer, and he's another one. He just makes everything sound fantastic. And Pat Metheny, as a sideman, does what he does best, elevates everyone and everything around him. A true team player, in my opinion. So there you have it. Michael Brecker, Time is of the Essence. Gorgeous album and kind of an overlooked album in the Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker collaboration, but still very enjoyable nonetheless. Excellent stuff. Love it. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 2001, and this sees Pat Metheny playing once again with saxophonist Michael Brecker, and this album features some of the biggest and most important names in the history of jazz music, who also happen to be both longtime collaborators of both Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker. And this one is called Nearness of You, The Ballad Book. So this is a different kind of album for Michael Brecker. This sees Michael Brecker going down the more ballad path. So there's lots of laid back tracks, and we see Pat Metheny playing in a much more laid back fashion, although he does get to shine with some wild moments. And it's a lovely album, and it features an all star band comprised of Pat Metheny on guitars, Herbie Hancock on piano, Charlie Hayden on bass, and Jack DeJohnette on drums, and a special guest appearance from vocalist James Taylor, who's featured on 2 tracks. And as I said, it's a ballad album, so there's more ballads, so there's not as much wild numbers as opposed to past Metheny Brecker collaborative albums, but it's still very pleasing, very enjoyable, and Pat Metheny's guitar playing, of course, is on full display, and he just sounds amazing, as do everyone on this album. And the tracks that stand out to me that feature some of Pat Metheny's amazing guitar playing is Nascente, which has got a great guitar synth solo, 7 Days, Always, I Can See Your Dreams, Midnight Mood, and The Nearness of You. It's a lovely album. Pat Metheny playing electric and acoustic guitars and guitar synth. He's just on top form, and the production on here is very much similar in terms of the sounding of how Pat Metheny's own albums sound, which is no surprise because this album was produced by Pat Metheny and Steve Rodby. And he's on top form as always, and he really knows how to bring out the best in all his fellow musicians. And even though this is Michael Brecker's album, he's on top form. Pat Metheny's right up there with him, and he just makes everybody sound even better. And for me, as I mentioned, the standout tracks where Pat Metheny's guitar play is on full display. I love Nascente. I think that guitar synth solo is just bone chilling, and it's almost like 2 minutes into the song, and Pat Metheny's already taking charge, and he just elevates the music even further just by that solo alone. And the cool thing about Pat Metheny in a band when he's a sideman, you've got to follow him. So you hear Pat Metheny playing an unbelievable guitar solo, and you're there right next to him thinking, I've got to follow that. you know? So Pat Metheny's attitude has always been, I've got to follow him, but I think for everyone else, it's like, I've got to follow that guy. No, thank you. But Pat Metheny really shines on this album a lot, and I love his playing on this. It just sounds absolutely incredible. And as I said at the beginning, much like Alan Holdsworth, when Pat Metheny comes on with a solo, it just blows everyone away. And his guitar playing on all of these sideman appearances are the highlights. You know, the music's great, everybody sounds fantastic, but when you come out of listening to the whole album, the one thing that always stands out the most is Pat Metheny's guitar playing. And with this album, it's no exception. His guitar playing really stands out, and he just steals the show like he always does. So there you have it. Michael Brecker, Nearness of You, the Ballads book, excellent stuff, and another great showcase to see a different side of Pat Metheny's playing. Tremendous stuff. Love it. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 2007, and this would mark the final time for a while that Pat Metheny would play and appear on an artist's album as a sideman, and this would also mark the final time that Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker would play together, as Michael Brecker would pass away months after this album was completed. And for me, it's a fitting final chapter for a legendary collaborative association that kicked off back on Pat Metheny's double 8081 album. And this is some of Pat Metheny's most ferocious playing. And to actually hear Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker bouncing off each other, trading unison lines, and trading solos never got old. It was always magical hearing Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker playing together. And to actually listen to this album, and when you go back to the first time they played together, all the way to the final time that they played together, you could really hear and see how much these two grew together and evolved in their playing. And Pat Metheny on this album has a very large presence and he plays a huge role in the music. But Michael Brecker and Pat Metheny don't come alone. They play alongside some very big heavy hitters. And this album is called Pilgrimage. So, this, of course, features an all star band. So, we've got Pat Metheny on guitars, we've got Herbie Hancock on piano and Fender Rhodes on one track, Brad Meldo on piano, John Patitucci on bass, and Jack DeJohnette on drums. And another first for Pat Metheny. This is the only album that features Pat Metheny and John Patitucci playing together. Unbelievable. You know, that's another one of those dream teams. You know, I talked about this earlier about Pat Metheny only playing with Stanley Clarke on Tony Williams' Wilderness album. And I talked about it earlier when I said that Pat Metheny has only played with Terry Lynn Carrington once on Gary Thomas's Till We Have Faces album. So this is the only recorded album that features Metheny and Patitucci together, and they work wonders. Very surprised they've not done anything together in the studio. I know they've done some trio gigs live, but I'm very surprised that they've never actually done something together in the studio. That needs to change. Now, as far as Pat Metheny's playing on this album, absolutely incredible, and he really burns it up here. And I wouldn't say he's in shredder mode like he was with Gary Thomas, but he still burns. And, you know, him and Brecker together was just magic, as I said earlier. And it's interesting because, as I said earlier, the bulk of Pat Metheny's work as a sideman was with sax players. And I find it very interesting that after Pilgrimage, Pat Metheny wouldn't play with any sax players for quite some time. And he wouldn't really play with another sax player until the Unity Band project with Chris Potter. So there's something there, you know, it just shows you how important Michael Brecker was to Pat Metheny and how important Pat Metheny was to Michael Brecker. And there's some unbelievable guitar playing on this album. There really is. And as I said earlier, Pat Metheny's got a massive presence on Pilgrimage, and all the compositions are written and composed by Michael Brecker. So this is like the first where Michael Brecker composed all of the material, and he really gives Pat Metheny a massive platform to do his thing. And wow, the results are epic. And the standout tracks for me, featuring Pat Metheny's guitar playing, The Meantime, Anagram, Tumbleweed, which has got a burning guitar synth solo, and the title track Pilgrimage, where Pat Metheny and Brecker just go absolutely nuts together at the end. Do, do, do. Do, 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 do. Love it. Absolutely love it. Chills. Absolute chills. And Pat Metheny, he does what he does best. He makes everyone look good. He makes everyone sound good. And he elevates everything and everyone on this album. Tremendous stuff. I love it. So there you have it. Michael Brecker, Pilgrimage, a fitting final chapter for the Pat Metheny Michael Brecker Collaborative Association. Love it. One of the best albums of their long association. And wow, Michael Brecker goes out on top form. And who better to do it with than Pat Metheny? And it's kind of fitting as well because Pat Metheny appeared on Michael Brecker's first album back in '87. And then fast forward almost, 20 years later, he appeared on Michael Brecker's final album. So nice to bring it full circle, in my opinion. So there you have it. Michael Brecker, Pilgrimage. Excellent album and a fitting final chapter for the Pat Metheny and Michael Brecker Collaborative Association. Love it. So we move on to the next Pat Metheny Sideman album, and this one came out in 2015. And this one was kind of like a special one-off appearance for Pat Metheny after recording and playing on Michael Brecker's final album, Pilgrimage. Pat Metheny would not play with any more sax players for a really long time, and even going as far as to say that he wouldn't be doing any more sideman work and he would concentrate mainly on his own career with his own solo projects up until the Unity Band project with Chris Potter. But that was more his own thing. But as far as sideman appearances, that would pretty much all stop up until this album featuring a young saxophonist from Kansas City, the same place where Pat Metheny grew up in. And this was a very special album, and this features, in my opinion, some of Pat Metheny's dirtiest, most aggressive, and wild guitar playing that he's ever put down in all of his sideman appearances. And the young saxophonist he worked with is Logan Richardson, and this album is called Shift. So, as I mentioned already, this is Pat Metheny's one-off sideman appearance, and it doesn't disappoint. He returns with a vengeance, and he has never ever sounded better than he does on Shift. It kind of reminds me of Till We Have Faces with Gary Thomas. It's wild, it's dirty, it's cutting edge, it's gritty, and Pat Metheny is really in shredder mode here, and he just absolutely cooks. And the sound that Richardson and Metheny create together in unison is just absolutely incredible. And Logan Richardson, he was kind of like the young up and coming guy. He'd already had two albums out before, which were okay, but bringing Pat Metheny in as a sideman, but more as a special guest, not only elevated Logan Richardson, but he elevated everyone who played on this album. And I feel that Logan Richardson has become the man that he is now thanks to Pat Metheny, much like what Pat Metheny did with Joshua Redman on his Wish album. He did the exact same thing here for Logan Richardson. And Logan Richardson, he's on a real roll right now, and he's put out some incredible music. And a lot of that is thanks to Pat Metheny, who really helped put him over in a huge way. And Logan Richardson has put together an all-star band. So we've got Pat Metheny on guitars, Jason Moran on piano and Fender Rhodes, Harish Raghavan on bass, and Nashit Waits on drums. So an all-star band, and wow, the material that Logan Richardson has put together is just incredible. And it's all originals apart from one cover, which is by Bruno Mars, you know, but wow. And I have to often question about this album. It's fantastic. I'm not taking that away from it, but I have to wonder, whose album is this really? Yes, it may say Logan Richardson at the top, but is it a Pat Metheny album? Because he's got a huge presence on this album. Out of all his sideman appearances that we've discussed here, I think this album could be his biggest presence. He just absolutely dominates. Big guitar solos. He just rips it up. And I think personally, he's never ever sounded better than he does here. And he takes Logan Richardson to his limits. He really pushes him. And I think thanks to that, Logan Richardson has come out of this an even better sax player. So we've got Mind Free, Creeper, In Your Next Life, Locked Out of Heaven, Slow, When I Wake, Interlude, Imagine, Alone, In Between, Interlude, Time, Entitled, Untitled, and two bonus tracks, Dreamweaver and Shifting Sand. But the whole album from top to bottom is excellent. Pat Metheny just rips it up on every single track, and he really cooks, and he packs a mean punch. As I said, this is Metheny at his most aggressive and wildest, and he really shines on this one. And this is his final appearance as like a full-time sideman, and he doesn't disappoint. And the standout tracks for me that feature some of Pat Metheny's best playing: Mind Free, Slow, Imagine, Shifting Sand, and When I Wake, Interlude, and Time. But wow, I highly recommend you get the Japanese edition of this album. It's got two bonus tracks, as I mentioned, and it's just fantastic. It really is. And it's not very well known. Some people may not know about this one, but I highly recommend you check this out. If you want to hear Pat Metheny as a sideman playing with another musician and hear some of his most wildest playing, this is the one. Check it out. It's just unbelievable, and it's just jaw-droppingly impressive. So there you have it. Logan Richardson, Shift. Excellent stuff, and probably my all-time favourite Pat Metheny sideman album. Love it. So which Pat Metheny sideman album do I think is the best one? Well, as I said at the beginning, some of Pat Metheny's best guitar playing has been as a sideman, and all of his albums are all different, and they showcase Pat Metheny in various different environments, in different genres of music, and I love them all. You know, obviously there are some that are a little bit better than others, but it's a tough one. But as I said at the beginning, the one that I've chosen as the best one, as the best Pat Metheny sideman album, might surprise some of you, but it's the one that I go back to the most, and it's the one that completely blew me away. And the one that I consider to be the best Pat Metheny sideman album is Logan Richardson's Shift. As I said, this features some of Pat Metheny's dirtiest, wildest, and most aggressive guitar playing ever, and he has never ever sounded better than he does here. He just really rips it up and just goes for it, and he just elevates the music and really makes it his own. And he dominates this album so much to the point I even question, is this really a Pat Metheny album, or is this a Logan Richardson album? I mean, Logan Richardson's a great composer, but he can't write stuff like this. I mean, he's a different kind of musician to Pat Metheny. So I do wonder, but it's just pure speculation. We'll never know. But this for me is Pat Metheny's best guitar playing as a sideman. I love all the stuff he did with Brecker, Garrett, Mark Johnson, Gary Thomas, to name a few. All those sideman appearances, they're all excellent. But for me, Logan Richardson's shift, he has never sounded better and has never shined more brightly than he does here. So there you have it. Logan Richardson shift, my all-time favourite Pat Metheny sideman album, and for me, his best one as a sideman that showcases his best playing ever. Absolutely love it. Tremendous album. Great stuff. So that's going to be it from me. I'm going to wrap this up now. What's your favourite Pat Metheny sideman album? Is it Joni Mitchell, Shadows and Light, Mike Metheny, Day In, Night Out, Michael Brecker self-titled, Gary Burton Reunion, Jack DeJohnette Parallel Realities, Gary Thomas Till We Have Faces, Joshua Redman Wish, Roy Haynes TV, Michael Brecker Tales from the Hudson, Tony Williams Wilderness, Kenny Garrett Pursuance, The Music of John Coltrane, David Lieben The Elements Water, Mark Johnson The Sound of Summer Running, Gary Burton Like Minds, Michael Brecker Time Is of the Essence, Michael Brecker Nearness of You, The Ballad Book, Michael Brecker Pilgrimage, or Low. There's no right or wrong answer. We all have our favourite Pat Metheny Sideman albums. You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below. And I will see all of you next time for another edition of the Jazz Albums Review Series. So until then, take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.